Welcome to the Threat Intelligence Podcast, Episode 11. It's July 22nd, 2026, and while we were in production for this episode, we heard more details about the Hugging Face OpenAI hack. This episode is split into two parts, with the first part being Rachel James and Dr. Brian Nakayama discussing this event in real time. The second part was what we recorded 2 days prior.
So Dave, I think I really appreciate your use of the word arms race there.
Welcome to the Gen AI Security Project Threat Intelligence Podcast Series, Episode 11.
What happens when those people are operating without guardrails?
Where expert hosts Rachel James and Dr. Brian Nakayama, co-leads from the Gen AI Security Project Threat Intelligence Initiative, dig deep and help navigate the ever-evolving threat intelligence landscape. The opinions expressed in this podcast are theirs and theirs alone and do not reflect the opinions of the organizations through which they are employed. Welcome back to the Threat Intelligence Podcast with Dr. Brian Nakayama and Rachel James. We're jumping in. This was something that has happened. This is a late breaking news story. I feel kind of like Kermit the Frog on Sesame Street, and I need that cool music because we were literally in the middle of editing episode 11 when this happened, and it was some light was shed on the topic we were covering. And this has got to do with Hugging Face, and this has got to do with OpenAI. And OpenAI is the company that has ChatGPT. And so I'm just going to jump into it because this is something that the two of you are, this is your wheelhouse. So tell me, let's expand on what has been discovered within the last, I think it's 12 hours around the incident with an AI getting out of a sandbox. Maybe one of you can hop in. Rachel, what do you think?
We were talking about Hugging Face disclosing that they had a security incident where they believed AI had compromised their infrastructure. What we have learned in the past 12 hours was the AI agent that compromised their infrastructure was a open AI model. It was two models. It was GPT 5.6 Sol and a more capable pre-release model that actually escaped OpenAI's containment to attack Hugging Face. So the sandbox escape essentially was OpenAI was testing the security capabilities of these models in a benchmarking environment, which they believe they had containerized, they had sandboxed and isolated to perform this type of benchmarking safely, and it escaped and ended up attacking Hugging Face. Brian, you want to talk a little bit more about some of the details of this?
After the OpenAI model, was able to successfully hack Hugging Face, thinking that it was going to get the answer sheet to exploit Jim, right? Hugging Face saw, thousands of events. And, I think one of the most interesting things, just to repeat, right, is that they tried to analyze this using commercial model APIs, but the volume, right, first of all, was too much. And second of all, they hit guardrails, which prevented them from being able to actually, evaluate it, right? Which then led them to turn to GLM 5.2, an open weight model produced by a Chinese lab in order to analyze their logs. And so it kind of points to this really interesting tension again between open weight models and how they don't have the same set of guardrails as proprietary models, and the way that challenges, first of all, US AI lab dominance, but then second of all, how do we actually use models as cybersecurity professionals if our choices between, high capability, expensive, restricted model versus high capability model with kind of, let's say not necessarily inherently questionable, but, kind of real questions about its origins coming from, Chinese AI labs.
Yeah, I think this was exactly what's so fantastic. It's funny that we get excited about these kind of events. But what's so fantastic about this is that it really highlights this asymmetry that we've been expressing concern about, right? So what happened here is when OpenAI was attempting to test these models' cyber capabilities. So they wanted to estimate the sort of maximal cyber capabilities by running these models in this evaluation environment called the exploit gem, right? And they reduced the guardrails on those models and put them in this, very highly isolated environment. And so, this highlights some of the asymmetry that we've expressed concern about, where what happens when threat actors, or I guess in this case, people testing hacking capabilities in AI. What happens when those people are operating without guardrails, and then the defenders are now limited in their ability to respond to those attacks by the guardrails that are in place? So, this is a perfect example of that type of asymmetry. I think it's pretty significant to say, I believe Hugging Face's disclosure was around July 17th. We are just hearing about this disclosure in the last 12 hours, so that had been, July 21st. So that's a significant amount of time where essentially OpenAI didn't realize their own AI had escaped this environment and had gone on the internet to hack Hugging Face.
So as a layman, as the podcast guy, as the layman, that to me is scary because it sounds like they don't have control. And isn't that something that we discussed in one of our first episodes, where this is a computing system that we as human beings don't really have access to the back end. We can't, pop the proverbial hood and check what's going on. So not only can you not see what's happening, it's learning on its own, but now it's kind of sprouted legs and walked out of the sandbox. It's kind of scary.
Well, so this is really interesting. This escaping the sandbox test environment. First, I think is really important to point out that they did intentionally reduce the safety warnings and the guardrails that were in these models in order to perform this test. Now, they did intend this to be in a highly isolated environment, but the real fascinating part about this is, AI, we're using AI for red teaming and for hacking purposes because we want to harness its creativity. So when you give instructions to an AI, it can really creatively decide how it's going to execute, right? So in this case, it essentially decided it was going to cheat on its own evaluation. This was a benchmarking environment intended to measure how good the model was. And the model decided that the best way to perform on this benchmark was to steal the answers. Now, the result of it deciding to take that path is it ended up exploiting two different, very novel zero-day exploits. The 0 days are exploits are undiscovered. They're unknown by the company where the vulnerability exists. And it also changed together multi-step exploits for privilege escalation. So we're talking about, without human intervention, 4, 5, 6 steps of exploits to successfully steal the answers to a test. And I'll just bring up a sort of story about my own experience with this. I had a colleague who similarly had built a benchmarking environment in order to test some AI agents we were developing for offensive security testing. And he came back after a weekend of running these in that environment, quite amused that the way the AI agents had decided to win this particular benchmarking test was to hack the benchmarking leaderboard that displayed the results and simply change their score. So, as far as, it is pretty scary. I think the way that this was contained, it escaped to the internet because there was a small hole that was sort of punched into this benchmarking environment in order to do in order to do package updates to the software. And they were able to use that very narrow internet connection to escape and go hack Hugging Face. Brian, when I'm thinking about this, I'm thinking about so many teams out there who are developing their own AI red teaming surfaces. And speaking for myself, I don't know, we don't really have an incident response plan in place for, what happens if somebody's testing harness escapes their environment and starts attacking us? Or, for these teams, what do you do if your AI, you get a phone call that somebody says, hey, your AI system you built to test your own environment has escaped and is attacking us?
Yeah, no, I think that's kind of raises real, I think, almost certainly this is going to lead to some sort of interesting regulatory response, right? In kind of two instances. First of all, is this a felony under the CFAA, right? The Computer Fraud and Abuse Act? If there isn't someone hands on keyboard hacking, where does liability fall when a model attacks a third party, right? Even if it wasn't malicious, right? How do we assign responsibility?
Hugging Face very specifically says, we don't think there was anything malicious on OpenAI's part, but to your point, that didn't really matter. The AI was taking a creative path to winning a competition and ended up really disrupting this company.
Yeah, no, I think it's one of those things where, you can imagine, let's say you're using AI somehow in connection to patient records in a health insurance context, training it, and you're trying to get some sort of accuracy score, and it decides the best way to do it is to access a HIPAA protected environment, right? Something like that. So there are ways in which you can imagine reward hacking having much greater consequences than just this instance, which then, again, goes back to questions of who's liable and what will happen, right? So that's that first instance, who's liable when, your agent hacks another company, even if it's not malicious intent, right? And the second question is, are we going to see, kind of a, re-application of attempts at export controls and regulatory action to restrict access to these advanced frontier models, right? Which is then going to accentuate what we're talking about before of that double bind between having to go between a restricted and expensive, kind of proprietary US frontier model versus a, kind of open weight model of questionable provenance, right? And then, even then going further down the line, you could again imagine this then serving as greater, impetus for some sort of action to be taken against Chinese open weight models. And so I think, one of the more interesting things for me is that I think the reactions to this incident are going to be, in a sense, much more interesting than the incident itself, right? These aren't necessarily novel capabilities. It wasn't a novel attack chain. It was just so happened that it happened to escape containment. And so it's going to drive kind of bigger questions about, who's responsible and how are we able to actually use these models going forward.
Yeah, and speaking about it not being super novel, one thing that immediately popped into my head was, oh yeah, back in April, Anthropic, reported that Mythos had escaped a sandbox. So we know that that AI sort of creatively attempting to achieve its goals by escaping its own constraints is that's not new either. I think a lot of people forgot that because of the other guardrails that were put into place, that when this happened with Mythos, it was sort of a quiet announcement, and there wasn't this huge impact because it didn't result in a third party getting hacked. But a lot of security professionals have been recommending sandboxing and containerizing AI agents as a security guardrail. And now I think we really need to scrutinize that advice a little bit more.
So maybe we can leave it there with these open-ended questions, because this is an onion whose layers keep multiplying. Thank you very much, Rachel James, Dr. Brian Nakayama, for this impromptu news flash with the Threat Intelligence Podcast. Now let's get you back to the original episode 11 of the Threat Intelligence Podcast. Hugging Face, great name. I'm the podcaster. You guys are going to explain it. This big AI model sharing site says they got hacked by an AI that was basically running itself, and then they used another AI to investigate. Rachel, is this as wild as it sounds, or is there a boring version underneath?
Actually, this was really interesting, and this is one of those places where I think the devil is in the details. It's really fascinating from a couple of standpoints. So what we're talking about is we're actually discussing something Hugging Face themselves published. It was a security incident disclosure that they published in July, and it was activity that was detected over a week of time. It was an attack over a single weekend. There was over 17,000 recorded events. distinct attacker actions across some very short-lived sandboxes. So what they were able to do is actually use a malicious data set to complete this attack. And so there was a remote code data set loader that was bypassed. This template injection in the dataset config resulted in code execution on a processing worker. So the real entry point isn't really sci-fi so much as it's the AI supply chain sort of oldest set. That malicious data set abused two different code execution paths to then be able to execute arbitrary code on a processing worker. So that from that foothold where you're now able to execute code, that's sort of your initial foothold on any penetration testing, any attack vector, you're able to do privilege escalation, then container escape. They were able to harvest credentials from metadata, perform lateral movement across the Kubernetes clusters all over a single weekend. So what's genuinely fascinating about this is, again, things that we have talked about on previous podcasts that often get attributed to AI is that tempo of the tradecraft. So 17,000 actions across these sandboxes, self-migrating C2 on public cloud, and sort of this like deliberate decoy activity to bury real moves in a huge amount of noise. That behavioral pattern is one of the strongest signals that we've ever seen reported on, that actually there really was an autonomous agent that was working here. So I think, the other piece of this that was interesting was, as you said, using another AI model. They did attempt to using another AI model to analyze this activity. In the report, they did try to use some frontier model providers, AI models, to analyze this attack, and they were running into guardrails. They were running into rejection. So they actually had to use a local open source model in order to analyze this attack. Because again, 17,000 actions over a weekend is a huge amount of data to be trying to analyze in an incident response context. So I think for red team and incident responders who might be listening to this, for the red team takeaway is, stop treating uploaded data sets and models as just data. Require signed safe tensors, give machine learning workers zero metadata access. The supply chain issue is going to get worse, and we probably need to give it the same treatment we gave NPM in terms of our skeptical pieces of this. But I think what's really fascinating, like I said, the devil in the details here outside of that is the fact that they were sort of, this is Hugging Face, and they were sort of forced to use an open source model to analyze this in an incident response context because they weren't able to use frontier models and that level of capability to figure out, as defenders, to figure out what an attacker was doing, attacking them with AI.
So the part that gets me is the defense. They said that normal big name AIs refused to help investigate. Brian, what happened there, and how confident are we this was really an AI attacker and not a human who was just very, very fast?
Yeah, so I'll take your second question first. The main way that Hugging Face kind of inferred that an agent was used was due to attack volume, right? 17,000 events. And so this kind of goes back continuously to one of our major refrains in this podcast that, the vast majority of AI use in attacks, except for when you have access to prompt history, is inferred, right? Inferred based on little comments left on the code, inferred based on structure, or in this case, inferred based on attack volumes. So theoretically, 17,000 events could be consistent with, automation, right? It's not necessarily a smoking gun. That being said, I do think it's a fair inference for Hugging Face to make that they were attacked by an agentic system. One thing that they do note is that it appears to be a research test harness, and I'd be a little bit curious to know a little bit more about how they made that sort of assessment. But I think it's worth having a little bit of doubt. And as always, we can only really indirectly observe the use of AI by threat actors. Now, to get to your first question, right, I think this gets to a really interesting debate that's happening right now that goes beyond this Hugging Face example, which is what are the proper safeguards on the use of large language models, particularly frontier models, in cybersecurity, right? And how do we balance the interests of defenders and researchers versus those who are trying to prevent, bad actors from getting access to these models, right? And so it gets to the kind of foundational, observation about frontier models in cybersecurity, which is to say that they're dual use, right? They can be used for good and for bad. And Anthropic, in particular, has taken a very kind of restrictive approach due to their experience with Mythos and Fable of having very high guardrails around cybersecurity uses of their models. It'll frequently refuse, kick you onto a different model, etc. And I see constant complaints on LinkedIn, on social media, elsewhere, that people are saying like, look, this is unusable. And it's a little unfair that, threat actors can go out, jailbreak, or get access to an open weight frontier model and be able to do these attacks. And we're not able to use our commercial vetted safe models in order to analyze these incidents, right? And so I think it, again, kind of points to this really huge tension, the fact that, cybersecurity capabilities by LLMs are dual use, and how do we approach that? And in this instance, you see Hugging Face going to a Chinese open weight model, the GLM 5.2, which we did discuss a few weeks ago, and using that instead, right? Precisely because, the first instance guardrail issues, but then the second instance, the volume of events that they needed to analyze. It's very expensive to run frontier models, right, on that volume of events. And so it's interesting to see this turn to what is seen to be the greatest threat to the AI industry in the US, right, Chinese open weight models, precisely because of these constraints that they're facing, right, from guardrails, from cost.
And I think too, going back to some of the things that we've said before, I was reading really recently. I don't know if you saw the same article because I heard it kind of quoted in a bunch of other places. It's looking now like these open source models, that their capability compared to the bleeding edge frontier models is only about a 4-month difference. So if you have now our open source models that are being released are only about 4 months behind in capabilities as the frontier models. So if you're a cybersecurity professional who wants to use AI to defend against threat actors who are using AI to attack you, are you actually somewhat handicapped if you're using the latest and greatest frontier models that your company is probably paying an enormous amount of token cost for you to have access to, but encounters all these guardrails? And this is a real life example of exactly what we were warning about and what we expressed concern about do these guardrails saying, please security review this code, and you come up with a guardrail. That's not really hurting the bad actors, but it is hurting the defenders. This is a real example of where Hugging Face now had to do exactly what we had recommended cybersecurity people begin to think about is, do you need to have access to an open source model in order to adequately use it in defense against threat actors who are using AI against you? Are you in fact handicapped or working at a disadvantage if the only thing you have accessible to defend, to analyze attacks, to analyze malware is these frontier models that have these really persistent guardrails?
Well, I think another wrinkle to that, of course, too, is the fact that these open weight models are coming out of China, right? Which, if you're anywhere near compliance, if you're anywhere near supply chain vetting sources, are going to cause a lot of headaches depending on what industry you're in, right? Which is to say there's anything inherently wrong with a Chinese created model, but if it's, created by, let's say, trained by a company that has links to the Communist Party in China or their military, that's certainly going to throw up a lot of flares for the compliance department, which then makes leveraging an open weight model particularly difficult because you have to deal with those supply chain issues because they're coming out of a specific country, right? So it really puts U.S. entities in a bind, U.S. companies in a bind where, they have to deal with a frontier model, right, which is going to be expensive and restrictive in its uses, or they potentially try and find an open weight model, the most powerful of which are coming out of a country which, many companies, compliance departments, for better and worse, have a lot of issues with, kind of sourcing, particularly for these sorts of critical technologies. And so, it really kind of demonstrates the difficulties in terms of creating policy around the use of frontier models for cybersecurity, right? Use cases. Again, given the fact that they're dual use, right? And again, points towards what's particularly interesting about this ecosystem right now in that tension, right? Between open weight, frontier closed weight, and how that interplay plays out in terms of offense and defense.
So the bottom line, somebody uploaded a poison data set to Hugging Face, and from that one bad file, an automated attacker escalated and roamed their internal systems all weekend. But the public models everyone downloads stayed clean. The plot twist, the big commercial AIs refused to help investigate because the evidence looked like malware, so Hugging Face had to use a free, self-hosted AI to do the detective work. The lesson for the whole industry is treat every uploaded model and data set like a stranger's USB stick and keep an unfiltered AI in the toolbox for the day you actually need it. Did I get that right?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I think this highlights a couple of things that cybersecurity people need to be thinking about. All of the problems that we have, the supply chain for applications prior to AI was always one of the most difficult things for cybersecurity folks to get our arms around. And this has just compounded it. And some of the other reporting that we have done on this podcast, where we've highlighted that there are now threat actors who are specifically designing their attacks to target supply chains for AI, targeting vibe coding. This has only become a much bigger problem, and it's accelerating at a scale that I think a lot of cybersecurity folks have not even begun to think about the governance around AI supply chain, about how do we actually treat, as cybersecurity folks, these data sets. Oftentimes, the data acquisition, the data set acquisition, the data normalization, the data processing is happening from research departments and from divisions inside of companies that cybersecurity folks don't traditionally interact with, don't traditionally influence a lot of the security controls around that. And we need to think about that differently. We need to think about our supply chain risks as it applies to AI differently, and build new processes that we probably don't have in our organizations. And then the second piece that's really important is, at least right now, at least for the foreseeable future, if you truly want to be able to harness AI in a situation where you are either red teaming yourself in order to identify potential vulnerabilities that an AI-enabled threat actor could be identifying with their system, or you're trying to use AI in an incident response to respond to those attacks, you probably need to look towards those unfiltered AI models, which means looking towards open source models. And Brian brings up a really good point in that the majority of that availability of highly capable open source models right now, the majority of them are coming from China, which has its own compliance and security implications itself. So do you have the ability in-house to be really analyzing open source models and whether or not that they're safe for your organization to use? So I think this really highlights several dimensions of cybersecurity that I think a lot of folks haven't had to wrestle with before. And now it's becoming a more imminent conversation that people need to be having.
It's an eminent conversation on so many different levels. It's business, it's nonprofits trying to raise awareness online, and it also is the new frontier, dare I say it, of an arms race. I mean, we've got the open capable AI as a tool for the attacker and the defender at the same time, but the guardrails cut both ways. That's what makes this podcast we're doing and the work you both do and everybody at OWASP Gen AI Security Project do so unbelievably fascinating and so detailed and so dense. There's layer upon layer of this.
So Dave, I think I really appreciate your use of the word arms race there, because I think it really kind of highlights another tension with the Chinese open weight models is that I have no doubt within the next 6 months, there's going to be some sort of US federal government regulatory action trying to restrict the use of open weight models by businesses within the United States. And that's precisely because they provide competition to the top tier frontier models, which are seen as a cornerstone of the US AI strategy, right? And so this creates a huge risk for companies which are trying to build processes based on Chinese open weight models that, the day may come where the federal government knocks on their door and says, you can't use that anymore, right? And so it's interesting because on the one hand, you have, the frontier models who put tons and tons of guardrails in terms of what you're able to do and will change the model day to day. And on the other hand, when you try and go and get an open weight model in which you have a little bit more control over, you're facing real regulatory risk that any day now, and you can see OpenAI and Anthropic leaders actively, talking about the risks of Chinese open weight models, that any day now the US federal government's going to come down hard on them and try to prevent their being used for, the reasons of competition, but also some of the security reasons that we discussed earlier.
With that, I think we should draw episode 11 to a close. It's a ton of information to think about, to internalize. I'm sure we'll come back. I'm sure we will talk about this on a future episode. Dr. Brian Nakayama, Rachel James, thank you so much for your time and your information. I appreciate it. Thanks for listening to the Threat Intelligence Podcast, hosted by Rachel James and Dr. Brian Nakayama from the Gen AI Security Project. This podcast is produced by the Gen AI Security Project and Rum Runner Media. I'm Dave Hatt.